All right. We are here, I guess, live with the webinar. Let's just confirm and double check with everyone. But Ruud, I think we're on air.
I think we're on air.
This is the first time that we actually jump into a setup like this one. I'm not sure if anyone remembered Reacticon version 3 a couple of years ago. Oh, coincidence! I'm actually wearing such a Reacticon shirt as well. But that was back then, and this is right now a webinar on Magento and CSP. And I already witnessed a little bit the chat on YouTube. I saw a lot of familiar people. That's great. Plus, in all of those names popping up, I see that there's a lot of Magento gurus, I would say, that are eager maybe to know a little bit more about CSP and also share maybe their thoughts afterwards. So let's kickstart the webinar. So welcome, first of all. This webinar is hopefully the first of more, focusing upon CSP. And in a few moments, I'm actually going to do kind of like an introduction to CSP. I'm Jesse Rijtsma. I'm the founder of Yireo, trainer, developer, and I'm mostly going to talk about a couple of difficulties, a couple of problem areas with CSP. And actually, I'm backed up also with Ruud van Zuidam, developer at Citation, and I put him here on the slide as a Yireo brain partner, because part of this presentation about CSP difficulties and third-party scripts, he's going to do together with me.
Just see me as a sidekick.
Yeah, my funny sidekick.
I hope so.
And last but not least, Vinia is also in the back room here to talk about the developments with CSP and specifically Hyvä, not just Hyvä themes, but also the Hyvä checkout. And we'll slowly head towards that story. If there's any questions, we as speakers, we're not going to monitor the live stream. We're not going to monitor the Q&A there. But later on, we're able to pick up upon all of the questions that are being gathered. So make sure that if you have a question, just enter it there on YouTube, and we will pick it up later. So yeah. CSP. So as an introduction, I already assumed kind of like that you're familiar with CSP, because otherwise you wouldn't have joined this seminar, this webinar in the first place. And therefore, I think we are all aware of the fact that CSP, content security policy, is restricting website resources for very good reasons. In the past, we were suffering from attacks like MageGuard, and in general, actually, CSP is trying to prevent this by restricting website resources on multiple different levels. And most importantly, CSP is really about having also two different modes, the reporting mode and the restrict mode. And as soon as you actually have CSP up and running, then you might be seeing some CSP headers. Now, personally, whenever I deal with content security policy as a header or content security policy report only as a header, I always find that blob after that pretty hard to read. So I personally created a little tool, Yireo CSP Inspector, that might be of use as well. But the main point is that the policies are added to the header. And other places for one main reason, and that's basically for you to restrict resources, and we're going to talk more about that, but also to basically shift from that reporting mode into the restrict mode. So the reporting mode is basically helping us to prepare for something, and that's maybe the right introduction also to the webinar, because I really felt that a lot of us are struggling with CSP. We don't know basically how to prepare, and we don't know how to prepare for what. So actually in this webinar, towards the end, I hope that we answered a lot of different questions, but also that we addressed a couple of pain points and how to move forward with all of those pain points as well. Well, and the reporting mode is basically our transition period, our trial and error period, so that we can get ready for that that restrict mode in first place. And if nobody is doing that, then my claim would also be that maybe we just as well remove CSP altogether, because the whole purpose of the reporting mode is that somebody is paying attention. And as a matter of fact, and maybe Ruud, you can also share into that story. Once in a while, we're browsing different sites, demo sites also on the internet that are promoted by Magento developers and Magento agencies. And then the first thing that we do is actually open up the error console, and then we see all of these errors out there. So it's showing that well, there is a transition period, but ideally there's 0 errors, and that's where we need to kickstart the real story. Well, one tool to help maybe with that is Sunsec. Ruud.
Yeah, the Sunsec Watch. Sunsec is offering a free service that you can implement, and that will help you with scanning your site for existing CSP errors, and is offering you then a CPS whitelist that you can implement, and it keeps watching your site, hence the watch. So if there are new CSP errors on your site, you get a notification so that you can again adjust your CSP whitelist for that. It's one of the tools we're going to talk about today, and it makes your life as a developer a lot easier, because it will remind you of new stuff coming up, and it's a good tool to have in your workflow.
Well, and later on, we're going to jump towards more practical usage, and kind of like the areas where Sunsec Watch is definitely a big win. And I have to admit that I already saw on my personal site a couple of notifications coming in that I personally disagreed with. So note that actually having such a watcher service, the CSP reporting URI up and running, it doesn't mean that you only get the clean reports made by browsers because simply something is missing in your CSP policy, but you also get the spammers and the hackers in there that are sneakily trying to add their evil script on top of it. And therefore, Sunsec Watch is reporting things. It's notifying you of a certain missing rule, but it's still you as a developer, you as an integrator, that you need to pick up upon what that thing actually is, and if that's something to be adding to the CSP policy. Now, the whole goal here of reporting and dealing with notifications is actually to enable that restrict mode, and that's basically that the resources are blocked for real. And that's kind of like the final goal. The error console is not reporting anything anymore, and everything is just working. Now, the question then, of course, is how to get there, how to implement things correctly in Magento. And there's multiple different strategies or multiple different ways to whitelist resources. That could be done by domain name / host name. That's usually something that you add through a CSP whitelist.xml file within a certain module. It's also about hashing trusted scripts, either in a whitelist or theoretically through templating. And then last but not least, there's also the whole story about adding nonces to inline scripts. And I'm going to mention all three of them kind of like briefly, but so that we have a good impression of what this technology is really about. So first of all, a whitelist.xml file. This little example came from my own Yireo Google Tag Manager module. So therefore, it's mentioning all these resources from GTM. But it might be that actually generating this file is a bit hard. So Ruud, we were pleased to actually see only recently, I think it was yesterday, that Mark Just came up with a good solution.
Yes, yes, in the evening on LinkedIn, he surprised me on the evening before our webinar when he launched his Chrome extension. And we tested with that, and it's actually quite nice. The problem was that I had to find a Magento site with with actual errors, setting that up. And then I ran it on the several pages. There are a few hiccups in his extension that would make it a bit user-friendly, but okay, it's a very nice tool in finding. You scan all the pages one-on-one, and after that you do complete and generate, and you will automatically download a whitelist CSP to your computer that you can then use. Check it, of course, that you can then use and implement, and it actually removes all the difficulties I found on that specific site. So yeah. I think it's a welcome new tool for us, although it has to fit in your workflow.
Yeah. Well, and that the workflow was something that we were also together and together with a few others really looking for. I remember that about a month ago or so, I played around with a temper monkey script, and that temper monkey script was attempting to do kind of like the same thing as this browser extension. But I have to admit now that Mark just published this, I'm going to throw away that temper monkey script because it's just dead ugly, and this tool is just an awesome improvement of things.
Yes.
Now, that's basically covering the first part of implementing the CSP policy, the XML part. Unfortunately, there's another area, and that's mainly dealing with all kinds of different elements in templates, and I'm saying it a little bit vaguely because the current slide is showing actually a script being rendered in a certain way, and that script is an inline script, and a template, a PHTML template as part of the Magento theme could be including such an inline script. And later on, we're going to talk about the actual CSP policy that is either allowing this or not allowing this to happen. But if you want inline scripts to work and you want them to be whitelisted in CSP, what you basically need to do is make sure that that script tag is itself generated in a certain way. That could be done by using this secure renderer, which is available in newer Magento 2.4 environments. And as soon as that secure renderer variable is actually there in your PHTML templates, you can see that it's just a simple call passing on the entire body contents of that script and passing it on to the render tag method as a third argument. Personally, I dislike this approach for two reasons. First of all, the main thing that you see here is a here doc statement starting at line 3 and ending at line, 12 or so. And everything in between is actually something that JavaScript-wise is looking fine. But as soon as you want to insert PHP variables in the same content, it's looking differently than you would normally deal with PHP in a normal template. And that's the here doc standard. That's the here doc syntax within PHP. And I personally dislike that approach, also because you need to turn the entire template a little bit upside down. Now, the bottom line of this rendering is that in the end, the script is being accompanied with a so-called nonce. And that nonce is something that you can see here as well. However, here I just simply take a different approach. I call this the manual approach because I'm not relying upon the rendering of the entire script through something else. Instead, you just take your own script tag within a certain template, you inject yourself with a view model, and then within your own view model, you still need to inject yourself with this CSP nonce provider that is originating from the Magento core. And that's giving you in the end a string, a nonce, and that's being added in a manual way to that script. So either you use the secure renderer or you use that nonce mode, but either way, you need to do something for inline scripts for them to work. Now, there's a lot of tools out there that are helping us do that thing theoretically. So, Ruud, you came up with this listing.
Yeah, I came up with this listing, and I also looked on GitHub. That was all say about a month ago, and found a list of tools that other developers made. Some of them actually more than 3 years old. And I found this list, and on it were these 4 paid extensions. One of them just last week was is now for free. That's the CSP reports. So I tested that one. It's a Magento module. It will give you some configuration options in the backend, and it actually reports you in the admin panel if a new CSP error is found. So it could be useful in certain workflows. Looking into that, as you already said, we looked into several tools over the last month. Mark chose one being the last. Still, I have the feeling that we still need a better tool as developers, as agencies, a tool that not only fits in our workflow but makes it more. Don't know how to say that. Perhaps you have a better word for that, Jesse?
Well, yeah. So I think what you're after is that CSP shouldn't have took us by surprise, because it's already in there since Magento 2.3 point whatever. But we did nothing with it, or maybe some people did, but most of the people that I know didn't. And suddenly you see all of that attention, including this webinar. But it's still not completely there yet when it comes to best practices and ideal tools to help us. So we're stuck on this slide here as if we are promoting these tools, but it's not necessarily the case. There's a lot more other extensions out there, and all of those extensions are slowly leading into kind of like the message that we would like to give you, that there's still a lot to learn with CSP, especially when it comes to certain difficulties and caveats. But so far, kind of like an introduction to CSP. But then to make it more relevant, there may be the reason also why all of us are actually in this webinar. Magento itself was introducing the CSP module itself in 2.3.5, but actually only recently in Magento 2.4.7, which is somewhere in April this year, so 2024. Suddenly the policies changed, and most importantly, two things. The restrict mode was suddenly enabled on payment pages, and inline scripts were suddenly no longer allowed on payment pages, unless those inline scripts were whitelisted, as mentioned earlier. So that's basically using the secure renderer or using a nonce. But if it would not be nonced, to put it that way, then actually that inline script was not allowed. And because we were actually not ready at all, a lot of checkouts, a lot of shops broke simply by upgrading to Magento 2.4.7. With that, a lot of people became angry at Magento, like, oh, why on earth are you changing such a important thing with just a minor release, Magento 2.4 instead of 2.5 theoretically. And the reason for that was actually that the PCI DSS standard version 4 was introduced. It becomes required or mandatory in April 2025, and therefore currently we are in a transitional period, which means that we need to do everything possible to make sure that CSP or PCI DSS compliance is fully implemented. And that's basically bringing us to, well, a big question. Should we care or shouldn't we? So here it goes. First of all, the PCI compliance, as soon as we're focusing upon that, it's mentioning payment pages, and all of the payment pages, they need to be secure, /checkout, /admin sales. So because you can also deal with orders and their payment in the backend. ... with a first question. What if that default situation is a little bit more extensive? And as soon as we're dealing actually with certain payment providers, PayPal has a fast checkout. There's multiple PSPs that I know of that are adding things in the mini cart by configuration. So it's not necessarily something enabled by default. But as soon as you fiddle around with settings in the admin, it might just well be that suddenly it's no longer that the payment pages are including the checkout only, but other pages as well, product pages, category pages, who knows? And the person responsible for that is, first of all, you. PCI compliance boils down to that the PCI stands for Payment Card Industry. I need to sneak peek because I always forget this abbreviation. DSS stands for the Data Security Standard, and we now have version 4, and version 4 basically raises the bar. Specifically, there's 2 sections that are interesting. 6.4.3 in this case is defining requirements for script authorization, integrity, and inventory. And the interesting thing here is that authorization basically means that the shop, or you as a implementer of that shop, you need to make sure that whatever is running in that shop is actually running for real with a good reason. So that's the authorization, that you know that it's an authorized usage of JavaScript or theoretically other resources. Integrity means that well, if you're using a CMS page, that not some script kiddie is adding a script tag, an alert towards that CMS page contents, saving it to the database, and therefore also changing the behavior on the front end. So the integrity of the JavaScript on itself needs to be guaranteed. And both authorization and integrity is something that we can solve with CSP. The interesting part with the third point, the inventory, is basically that you need to create a listing of all of the scripts that are allowed to run, and make sure that you understand why those scripts are added in the first place. And especially this is kind of like a picky thing, because it doesn't deal with technology at all. It deals basically with you or the merchant, the webshop owner, knowing what scripts are being run. Now that's the first section. The second section zooms into specific attacks, and I'm phrasing this a little bit more careful, and maybe Vinia is able to chime into this later on as well. I asked him, like, where can we find this specific line for real somewhere in the DSS documentation, and you can't, but you can deduct kind of that the policies unsafe-inline and unsafe-eval are not allowed. And I'm going to comment upon these policies later, but that's kind of like the beginning of the story. Now, PCI compliance is a bigger thing. Your payments pages, they need to be secure, and you need to find out what kind of pages are payment pages. In general, it's basically those pages that are dealing with payment details, and that could be, of course, the checkout, but it could also be other pages. And that responsibility is something that is yours as a developer, but also the merchant is responsible for that, and secretly also the payment solution provider, the PSP itself, is often also responsible for this. So often, together with the PSP, you sign a document or you go through some kind of agreement to see to what kind of degree PCI compliance is a thing for your specific shop. And the interesting part here is it might not be relevant at all. So if I would look in my own shop, where, well, all of you got maybe tickets for free because of the webinar being for free, but in my Magento shop, I'm dealing with multiple different payment methods, but all of those payment methods are wrapped in a PSP that is redirecting you as a customer towards their portal. In other words, my shop is actually not dealing with payment details at all, except for the address. So it might be that PCI compliance is actually not really that important for me, but it is very important to the PSP itself. Question mark, because every PSP is kind of like authorized by the PCI authority to find out whether that PCI compliance is met or not. So in short, you need to find out together with your PSP whether this is actually the case. But if it isn't, you could disable CSP. In the past, you could just disable the CSP module. That's impossible right now, but there's multiple solutions out there. However, we now talk about PCI compliance, and the reality is also that CSP is not just about PCI compliance at all. Likewise, if you were meeting with PCI compliance earlier, you could still be hacked by the mage card attacks. So being vulnerable is something different from, well, keeping up the good work with a certain compliance. So yeah, Ruud and I, we came up with multiple of these points here mentioned. in general, I think that Ruud also agrees, security is important, and therefore CSP is also important. Not just for the front end, but theoretically also for the entire admin. But that's still kind of like a question mark. But to be short, it's important. Now, as soon as you're implementing CSP, you might bump into certain difficulties. And I'm mentioning just a couple of difficulties right here. Earlier, I already mentioned the policies unsafe inline and unsafe eval. I'm going to comment upon that a little bit more. I've bumped into the issue, or together with others, of large HTTP headers repeatedly. There's the marketeer story and the caching of nonces. And let me go through all of these problem areas one by one. First of all, unsafe inline. Referring back to you've got an inline script. If you do nothing about the authorization of that inline script, it's unsafe. So therefore, the policy is unsafe inline. In other words, if unsafe inline is part of the CSP rules, then any kind of inline script is just allowed regardless of nonces or not. And that specifically is not PCI compliant. Therefore, every inline script needs to be nonced and hashed for PCI compliance, but also for security. And I've created, as a first step into this whole story, a module called CSP whitelist inline JS. Don't use it, because my module is not aware of all of the scripts that are out there. It doesn't differentiate between an evil script and a completely legal script. Who is? Well, that's either the extension vendor or the system integrator. And either one needs to go in and actually detect whether a certain inline script needs to be dealt with or not. So in short, there's a lot to say here about inline scripting, and that's one of the problem areas that you need to go in. Another one is unsafe eval. And first of all, to comment upon what this actually means, in JavaScript, we've got a function called eval, and whatever you put in is just evaluated, is just executed. And it's not PCI compliant, simply because of the security impact. So having unsafe eval as a policy is bad. What we would like to have is that unsafe eval rule be removed from Magento. And then we bump into multiple different issues. First of all, Hyvä is depending upon libraries like Alpine and MageWire. And those libraries are, again, depending upon eval or something alike. I'll leave it up to Vinia to talk more about that. But that's definitely one of the bigger issues. So we can't reach PCI compliance in full unless Hyvä is prepared in a certain way. So hopefully everyone is still being tuned in until Vinia is doing his story. But the funny joke is still coming. Luma is facing the same issue, simply because jQuery, jQuery UI, Knockout are depending upon that same eval function. Knockout has a couple of workarounds, but for jQuery UI and jQuery, there are no workarounds. And on top of this, there seems to be little effort from Magento/Adobe to do anything regarding this. So simply put, with Luma, you are screwed. Completely different other story. Large HTTP headers. I recently was training a certain company, and that company was facing a ticket on their own open source extension where somebody was reporting, hey, the headers are too large as soon as I enable your module. So your module is at fault. However, it was not related to their module at all. It was just that that module was including CSP headers, a CSP policy. The CSP headers grew larger than the normal header limits that are configured specifically in this case in Varnish. And well, my personal take there would be, do not blame an extension vendor. Do not blame Magento for all of that. Simply just blame the hosting provider. Because similarly to that Magento only runs on a specific PHP version, similarly to the fact that Magento requires PHP variables to be set or specific PHP modules, I consider also header limits like this one to be part of those same requirements as well. Or you use the Basecom module, which is a great module, but for me, I personally see this as just a workaround for an issue that actually needs to be picked up upon by the web server configuration. But on its own, it's a problem again, so there we go. Yeah, and then towards a situation where I would like Ruud to join in again. The story about marketeers. So, Ruud, fire away. What do marketeers actually do?
Marketeers, aka the SEO agencies, they surprise you because when a month ago I implemented the CSP whitelist for a customer of mine, everything was fine. And then after not only a few days, I got the surprise that suddenly I got CSP errors on the front end, and I thought, what the hell is going on? And because the marketing agency controls the Google Tag Manager, they changed some stuff in the Google Tag Manager, and then some new scripts were loaded, for which I had to adjust the CSP whitelist, and that gave me at that moment the thought from, oh my god, but I don't want that. Do I want that as an agency, that a third party can inject scripts in my site? And why is the control lying for the Google Tag Manager with the marketing agency and not with me as an agency? If they want to implement the new script, I should be the one implementing the new script and controlling that, and not the marketing agency. And okay, I put it to you, Jesse, and said, okay, what do you think is a normal workflow between several parties working on a Magento web shop? And yeah, then we said, yeah, okay, it's the agency's responsibility. It shouldn't be the responsibility or either possible for a marketing agency to implement scripts without our control.
Yeah, and I think actually one good example that I personally struggled with, also because of you, was the consent mode. That as soon as you want to have the consent cookies being set and sent towards Google Tag Manager and then Google Analytics, there's two things that you can do. The hardcore coding in the application yourself, so a little bit of PHP, HTML, JavaScript, and to get things done. Or to simply go into the Google Tag Manager, select consent mode in the category of templates, click, 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 and then suddenly you have this consent mode script added on your site with ease. Well, except for one fact, it's totally conflicting with CSP rules.
Yes.
And actually 5 or 10 minutes before this webinar started, I said to you, hey, but actually it doesn't really matter, because as soon as you're dealing with the restrict mode and not the reporting mode, then actually such a third-party script simply doesn't work. So as soon as we're there actually with CSP, it's not that we need to do anything to make things work together with marketeers. No, actually, if the marketeers are adding something that we as a developer didn't really allow in that CSP rule set, then it simply doesn't work because it's being blocked by the CSP policy.
Yeah, but we never know the consequences of that. It
No.
could actually break our site or break our checkout. So it still is something that should be implemented in the right way in your workflow, so that you know for sure that your web shop won't go down on that.
Yeah. So in the entire presentation, this slide is actually one of the smallest, but actually its background story is, I think, one of the biggest. And its impact on workflow and how we as agencies or developers need to deal with scripts in the first place is a fundamental one. But the more PCI compliance is a thing, the more strict those CSP rules are being implemented, the more the problem is not ours, but actually the marketeers. And let's see what that turnout is going to be. Now, a last bit of troubles with CSP is this one, caching or caching nonces or not. The main story is actually that CSP nonces are supposed to be generated per request. So again, if you've got an inline script in some kind of template, then actually it's unsafe inline by default. To make it safe inline, you need to add a nonce. And a nonce is a number that is generated once, and therefore it should be regenerated again and again and again. On every request, regardless of the fact that maybe there's a page caching mechanism in there preventing that nonce to be refreshed. And currently in Magento out of the box, the Magento page cache is actually not supporting this. In other words, as soon as you enable the page cache, for a specific page, a nonce is being generated, but that nonce is also being saved in the cache so that everyone is actually getting the same nonce. And that's not security anymore. That's the opposite again. And I have to admit, I'm not a security expert, and I don't know about the real security impact of this. I'm sure that others can share their opinion about this as well. But the main point is, it's not supposed to be happening like that. A nonce is not supposed to be cached. Well, I sit personally down last week to fix this. And I created a small module that is fixing it. So it's basically nothing more than generating all of those CSP nonces after the page cache has loaded all of the HTML. But yeah, I personally consider this experimental, because I want others to chime in and to tell me that this is a correct solution or not. But it's at least showing that this is something we can fix. Another thing that is out there is varnish, and that's again also where the same issue pops up. So what if the page cache is not the built-in cache, but the varnish cache? Then at that moment, well, I'm not sure what kind of solution would be the best, because any solution that I investigated is actually leading into the compilation of varnish by adding new modules on top of it. And the most genius modules to make this the easiest is actually only shipped with Varnish Plus, so the paid version of Varnish, instead of Varnish open source, the free version. So as of yet, I would say that with Varnish, this is still a big problem that I don't necessarily know the good solution to. Well, at least I've mentioned the difficulties, and that's already a big story. But it's hopefully showing that well, we need to do something to be ready for CSP. It's not just that we need to enable CSP, do a little bit of whitelisting, and then we're done. There's all of these other side stories, all of these other technical tidbits that we need to take care of, and therefore I would say the struggle is not over yet. And maybe that's also a really good introduction for our next and last speaker, Vinia, who's going to shed some light on how this is all being done together with Hyvä. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing. Well, Vinia is here with us, which is great.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jesse, for having me.
Take it away, I would say.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. That was an excellent, very quick run through everything CSP in Magento. Very good. I just wanted to step back a moment, because since it's still a somewhat complex topic and not everybody is that familiar with it, I would like to start one step earlier and just reiterate, even if people already know, the basic idea behind CSP is to stop cross-site scripting attacks, right? So any kind of executable code being executed on a page is covered by this. And actually also images and CSS and anything else is covered by CSP too, but we're focusing on scripts here right now. So the idea there is that if usual XSS would be something like somebody hacking Magento and injecting some malicious code into a CMS block that then gets rendered on the page and then gets executed in everybody's browser, right? That's typical classical injection. Of course, it's not limited to simple script tags. It could also be meta tags, etc., image sources. So it's kind of a complex problem that is being tackled there. And that's why these different aspects come into play here. So authorization, integrity, and inventory, like Jesse mentioned, where we first have to say, hey, which hosts are actually allowed to serve, well, anything, scripts in this case, that we're focusing on this website, on this domain. And usually self is allowed, that's the host itself that we're currently visiting. But of course, many scripts are loaded from third parties. And they also need to be explicitly allowed, and we can allow them either on a concrete URL for that one particular script, or we can whitelist a whole domain, or even any number of sub-level domains, right? We can widen or loosen everything. It's also possible, by the way, to open up everything and just support any script source with a star, asterisk, placeholder, which of course basically turns off any security-related feature of this. So that's a good idea, probably, right? Because otherwise, such an injected code might load some party from a a hacked server, some script, a resource that then gets executed, and that would be a bad thing. And with CSP, as Jesse said, that would be prevented. The other part is that's the authorization. So who is allowed, where is the website allowed to load scripts from? The other part is the integrity part, which means even if a script is coming from an authorized source, is it still allowed to be executed, right? And that could be third-party hosts, again, some external payment provider or some other, it could be anything, of course. And those other hosts, of course, are also not really secure against hackers. We know many instances that sometimes make the round in the news, sites that get hacked on in the supply chain of, and then end up on some CDN, and suddenly the script gets modified on a well-known source, and even though we're loading it from an authorized source, it's now a malicious source. So that's where the integrity comes in. And the typical way to deal with this is we need a SHA, so a hash of the script source, and only if that source matches, if the browser recalculates the SHA and matches it against the SHA we provide, if they're the same, then the browser knows, okay, that's exactly the script that's authorized, and I'll execute it. Otherwise, it won't execute it. And that's, of course, important also for our own site, because even if we authorize scripts from our own site, from the site that's currently being visited, that if we are hacked and somebody injects a script, then it's loaded from an authorized source, self, but it's malicious. And that's where this nonce or SHA comes into play. And that's why it's so important that it's not cached, right? Or that we don't just add a nonce to every inline script, because otherwise, if there's some automation there that just adds the nonce to every inline script, for example, then the hacker could visit the site, see the nonce, because it's cached, he could take the same nonce, just add it to the injected code, and his script would be executed by the browser. That's why the nonce has to be random and has to be regenerated for every request to provide any kind of security. And just to reiterate briefly on where you ended up, so in regards to varnish, the problem is it's not just varnish, because the Magento full page cache uses HTTP caching semantics. So it could be any proxy in between. It could be Cloudflare or Fastly or any third-party proxy that's being used anywhere on the network that just looks at the typical HTTP caching headers and then caches our page, rightly so. So even if we write a plugin for 10 of these, we still wouldn't find a solution for all of them. So it's not a real option to replace the nonces on the fly out of the full page cache. So nonces are one option. That's this little nonce attribute that gets added, but we can only use nonces on pages that are not stored in the full page cache. If we have scripts on a page that are cached, we have to, like inline scripts, right? We have to use a different approach that CSP provides, which are, we have to take the hash of the script and add it to the CSP header. So it's authorized. And then if a new script is added to the page, then the hacker would also need to add the SHA of that new script to the header, which might not be as easy as just injecting a script in a database in a CMS book, right? So that's the security mechanism that has to be used for pages in the full page cache. All right. Yeah, so that's a little primer of when we now want to take Hyvä and make it CSP compliant, what comes into play there? What are we looking at? So first of all, let me share my screen just briefly here. Actually, maybe I can scale my full screen. Does this application support this? Probably. Yeah, that looks okay. Okay. I'll just assume this works. So here we've got the configuration file from the Magento CSP module, right? And I just wanted to start with this here, because here you can see we have the main configuration, whether we should run in report-only mode or not, and a bunch of different policies we can configure. So these are all the default policies. As you can see, there are many for fonts, for forms, for frames, for frame ancestors, for images, script source, etc., styles. So many different policies, and each can be configured there. And then Magento takes all of this configuration and builds a header out of it. Now, there's also the option that can be added to the env.php. That's usually what I do, because then I don't need to create a special module, and it also makes sense to declare these on a instance basis. So we can add this configuration to the app etc env.php. So here's an example where we set this in the mode on the storefront to report only, and I allow a valid inline. And if I switch that to 0, then all of a sudden, after I import this configuration, eval inline will no longer be allowed, right? And nothing will work anymore unless, the site templates are prepared for this. One last little bit here that I wanted to show was in the in the checkout module. We can see one additional little interesting part here, where we can see a different mode for storefront checkout index. So we can set a mode, whether it's report only or restrict mode, for a full action name, right, for any given route. So basically here, that's what Magento uses to distinguish between, hey, checkout should be strict mode, everything else can be report only. But to be PSI DSS 4.0 compliant, we can no longer use report mode on checkout pages. So that's where this happens. Of course, this config can also go into the env.php file. On a side note, I cringe every time I see whitelist here. It's an allow list, right? And they use this old outdated nomenclature here. So there are different places in Magento where stuff is whitelisted, which is just, cringe. Anyway, here we can see something, by the way, that is actually, okay, no, that's not what I wanted to talk about. I don't want to get distracted. Let's talk about Hyvä a bit. All right, so Hyvä, as many of you probably know, uses a lot of inline scripts. So what are we going to do? We are going to make a release of Hyvä that allows, that deals with this problem for inline scripts. We are going to release that pretty soon. And here's an example of a template. And what that's going to look like is we're going to, after each script tag, right, there's a view model called inline script, and you call register with CSP. This is our solution, so you don't have to use the secure renderer with here docs. What this does is, this view model is, this call has to be done directly after a script tag, right? And it simply looks at the output buffer of PHP, extracts the last script tag that's been added to the output buffer, and then it takes that content and generates a SHA for it, or can inject a nonce if it's a non-cache page, right? So this way, we can write our inline scripts as usual. We don't have to worry about any secure renderer and rendering PHP. We can, here it's fine to mix PHP and inline script. So it's very easy to work with, no change, but we still can use this in the way we want. So I much prefer this way of working with it rather than using this secure renderer. I checked with several security researchers, and they all couldn't find a reason why this would be less secure compared to the secure renderer. The only restriction is this has to be directly after the script tag, right? So it can't go in front, it can't go at the end of the template, it just has to go right there. It doesn't actually render anything, it just, as I said, looks at the output buffer. So that's how we can add the shards for the inline scripts to the CSP header. The other part that is Hyvä related is Alpine. One of the reasons why Hyvä by default is, well, amongst other things like easy to work with and fun to work with, while it's also fast, is it only uses a single JavaScript library, which is Alpine.js. Now, Alpine.js thankfully has a build called Alpine CSP, which is a version of Alpine that can work without unsafe eval. So, because what we looked at so far here, this register with CSP, that takes care of the unsafe inline. So with this, we can turn off unsafe inline and Hyvä still works. But the problem is unsafe eval. So what is unsafe eval? It means if you want to declare JavaScript functions dynamically on the fly, or if you want to use the eval function, for example, right? That is not allowed if you turn unsafe eval off in the content security policy. which generally is a good thing again, right? It makes the site more secure. So normal Alpine requires unsafe eval because we often have, I don't know, let's have a look at some kind of presenter mode. I can't even think of an example. Okay, let me go back to the default theme, and I just want to share one example here, something like, yeah, some kind of add click. Yeah, here we go. Why not this? Add click, right? So here we have an attribute. That's an event handler in Alpine syntax, and it's JavaScript, right? So how does Alpine take this string and then runs it as JavaScript? Well, it needs to use, it doesn't use the actual eval function, but it builds an inline function dynamically, and that's pretty much the same thing. So yeah, it needs to eval it. Now, if we use Alpine CSP, then this won't work anymore, right? Instead, all attributes have to refer to properties of the Alpine component view model, this object, right? And these properties can be either just variables, right, or value properties that simply would look up the key and return the value, or it could be a function. And if that looked up value is a function, it executes it, Alpine CSP. So if we want to use Alpine CSP, we lose this very convenient way of writing code directly in the attribute. Instead, we have to put a little more code into our view models here, right? And then everything still works. Now, going forward, what we'll do is relatively soon, we will make a release of Hyvä alongside our regular release. And this new release will include Alpine CSP, and the whole theme will be prepared to work without unsafe eval and unsafe inline. And that covers everything in Hyvä, so the whole theme, not just the payment-related pages. Because like Jesse already said, oftentimes we have other checkout means that are maybe rendered in an overlay over the theme, and suddenly every page where people have a buy now button, for example, becomes a payment related page, so it has to be in strict mode. Yeah, so that's the idea here. The idea is we release it now already to give extension vendors and implementers all the time till April to prepare their extensions. By the time then when it becomes more important to actually turn off report only mode, then they can prepare their stuff, right? And any new release that we will make in that time until then will be for both with Alpine CSP and without. And then after April 2025, we will start probably releasing new features just for the CSP version, while except for the old version, anything else, maybe if you're not required for some reason to use Alpine CSP, then if you're not required to be PCI DSS compliant, is what I meant to say, then you can keep using the old release, right? If there's any other security related release, we'll still make security releases, but new features, just because we don't have the resources, we'll just probably add them to the CSP releases in future, right? So we'll try to make this upgrade and migration onward towards Alpine CSP as easy as possible for everybody, with a lot of documentation and examples and little helpers like this view model and so on, to make it as convenient as possible to migrate a site into a state where it can be used without unsafe eval and unsafe inline. So you'll be well prepared for any future security CSP related security requirements that might come. A last word on the checkout, because currently MageWire does not support a version without unsafe eval, because it's based on Livewire, which doesn't support unsafe eval. By the time it becomes a hard requirement, so April next year, even if Caleb shouldn't have released a version of Livewire that supports that doesn't need unsafe eval, then we would have made our own version, right, that will support restrict mode. But yeah, that's yet to be determined. There's still some time So we're at least aware of it, and by the time it becomes a requirement, then you'll be able to use it, of course. So that's pretty much all in regard to Hyvä and Alpine CSP and unsafe eval, unsafe inline. Oh yeah, one last thing. The last thing also was this script inventory that's needed to be PCI DSS compliant. So the idea there is, of course, most of these scripts in the default Hyvä theme are written by, well, many people, a lot of contributors, or also the Hyvä theme. So what we'll do is we'll add a comment above each of the inline scripts explaining the purpose of the script. So the policy to be PCI DSS compliant, to have this inventory, you'll be able to generate that out of the default Hyvä theme. Of course, if you write custom scripts or have other modules, those would need to be added there too, right? We can only take care of the stuff we write. So yeah, we're trying to make it as easy and simple as possible for everybody to be CSP compliant, right? Even with a heavily customized site. Yeah, okay, and I think that's all that I've got right now, unless there are questions. I don't know.
Well, I think definitely there's going to be questions. So let me just briefly share a very important slide, which is just opening up the room for questions and answers. So first of all, thank you, Vinia, for shedding some light. Yeah, so as soon as I discovered that the unsafe eval situation was kind of like an issue with Hyvä, because it's an issue with Alpine and Livewire, I was kind of intrigued also by the story of Luma becoming compatible as well. But as of yet, I don't see anything happening there. But so I'm kind of like eager to hear more maybe in the future upon what is going to happen with Luma. Except for, of course, the option to kill it and move it into Hyvä. But that's a different story. Yeah, in the meantime, we've got plenty of questions. It's nearing a little bit the end or the initial ending time of the webinar. But I think actually the questions are definitely worth it to keep on going. So that being said, there's multiple different questions. So Lucas van Staden, or I should actually say Lucas van Staden, he came up with the question, do CSP nonces actually work with the GTM script injection? And the whole point is no. Hopefully this was addressed by Ruud and I. As soon as an additional external script is being loaded from some domain, then actually by default in the Magento configuration, this needs to be changing. This needs to be whitelisted. Now, there is an option out there that I didn't really mention, and Vinia neither. And that's actually that there's this strict dynamic option as well, which basically means that a certain script that is loaded, say the Google Tag Manager, could be loaded with this strict dynamic policy, so that every other script that is initiated through the Google Tag Manager is automatically not whitelisted, but allowed by the CSP policies. However, I've seen a lot of different discussions online about strict dynamic in other platforms, but with Magento, as of yet, I've not seen any code for real yet. And it doesn't mean that Magento is not fit for that. It simply means that the community needs to come up with viable solutions. Because the essential API adding CSP headers in a certain way would solve this. Next question is from Paul Partington. How can we handle 3DS payments, specifically version 2, with CSP? And that's actually also a reference to another question or remark that Daniel Sloof also mentioned. Fun fact, a standard Magento installation has the Braintree module, which sets the CSP frame-source policy to global with a wildcard. And that's basically, as I understand it, the same story. And the story is that through certain PSPs, dynamically all these other payment methods are being loaded, including their own validation scripts. And that's definitely for Braintree a specific issue. Braintree is, through their own JavaScript, dynamically loading all of these other scripts per payment provider, so per credit card company. And that theoretically leads into, well, all of these scripts that need to be whitelisted. How can you handle that? Well, by whitelisting it, by manually adding all of those URLs to a specific listing. And currently, the Braintree module had already a commit, or at least a discussion for a commit, open to add all of these different credit card company URLs that they're dealing with towards their own module. But yeah, in short, it's a manual action. And I personally believe that the extension vendors should come up with a solution, and at least also a better solution than just saying any kind of external iframe or frame is automatically whitelisted. So the wildcard approach that was also mentioned by Daniel. So yeah, I'm picking up upon a couple of questions, but Ruud, Vinia, if you want to chime in, just let me know. Or actually, a specific question also for Vinia from Mitchell van Kleef. Can you use the view model this way in any PHTML file? And he's, I think, referring to what was it? The CSP inline script view model.
I'm muted. I think I'm muted. Am I? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
No, you can. Okay. Weird. I'm just seeing my mic as muted. Anyway, yes, you can. Of course, it's just basic. Anywhere it's placed after any inline script, it just does its thing. So it's an alternative to the secure renderer. It's actually not even Hyvä specific in that regard. Just wanted to briefly mention this strict dynamic. I think it's super tempting for every organization with a fair amount of JavaScript to use one of these escape hatches that are provided by CSP to make their life easier, because it requires a lot of their changes for them, right? Braintree used one of those escape hatches there, right? And that's just, on the long run, I expect it won't cut it. It'll always become more and more strict, because hackers will use the escape hatches. And even if we don't use the escape hatches, there's still no silver bullet, but at least it's a little better. Right. So
yeah, and I think actually,
if that's a good solution. Yeah, we'll see.
Same thing for that policy to allow for the Google Tag Manager loading all kinds of external scripts. That you could also make that use the strict dynamic policy. I'm personally against it as well, simply because it's just leading towards so many possible bypasses, while the whole intention of CSP is to be strict. That's kind of like the movement that we see, that less is allowed unless you explicitly do allow it again. Another question from Lars de Weert, still Hyvä. Which Hyvä themes are going to be supporting then this new Alpine build? I guess that's what the question is about.
I'm not sure what's meant by which Hyvä themes. It's the Hyvä theme.
So yeah, so version 1.1, 1.2, or
no,
version 1.3?
Just the newest version.
Yeah, so 1.3.
So here's the thing. Alpine CSP will be part of the theme module. The theme module is backward compatible, so nobody could stopped, or everybody could install the new release of the theme module with a 1.1 or 1.2 Hyvä theme, and then make their scripts compliant. But won't go back and adjust all the scripts accordingly to be compliant there. Yeah. So the module works, but the theme itself is no upgrade there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it depends a little bit on how you create your own theme, whether you really depend upon the parent to be there of a specific older version, or that you're duplicating a couple of PHTML templates just to allow for this change. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, so I worked through all the scripts in Hyvä to make them compliant, and actually it's not hard at all. It's pretty trivial. It just has to be done, and I think it's definitely possible. It took me 1.5 days to make to all Hyvä Alpine components Alpine CSP compliant. It's not impossible.
Yeah,
that's all I can say there. Yeah.
Well, one question that I personally had about the CSP build of Alpine is that normally with, for instance, a click handler, you would just pass in old school a JavaScript expression. And currently this needs to be, for instance, a method name that is referring to a method in your component. But what if you want to pass in an argument to that method? So if I'm understanding this correctly, you need to solve that totally differently. You need to alter the state in a different way.
Good question.
But you
so here's a little sneak peek of one of the documentation pages that we're adding. So what we parsing arguments. There it is. So parsing arguments. Here we go. So because we can't specify JavaScript anymore in the method call as arguments, the easiest way is just to add them as data attributes.
Yep.
And then, because in Alpine 3 $L always refers to the element that contains the callback, right? We can access these attributes this way. And this, of course, could be JSON, could be a simple value, whatever. But yeah, that's how we will have to pass arguments there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that theoretically means that if you're really depending upon methods that with arguments specified in the old way, that the refactoring becomes a little bit more work. But yeah, still, it's once you do it once, twice, then it becomes easier, I guess.
Yeah. Again, it turned out I was a little weary. It turned out really not to be too bad, and I rarely had to add these arguments, interestingly enough, because especially for these event handlers, the event object is passed anyway by default. Yeah. So we get that anyway. We still can, we have a lot of state in the component. So for example, if we have x4, do I have an example of this here? I think I had it somewhere.
Search.
Xif. Yeah, here, for example, here we have an x4 snippet, right? So this still works, even though this looks like JavaScript. It's not really JavaScript that Alpine evaluates. It actually parses it and executes it kind of manually. So that still works as before. Now, here in this little list item that's being rendered here for a given number of items, we have the state, item, and index. And then later, when this is clicked, right, even though at first I thought maybe this is only available while this is being rendered, but the state actually is referred to. So in the register click function, I can just refer to item, and that's the variable of that specific iteration. So Alpine sets the scope of the callback up correctly. So in effect, in the current theme version, actually, item would be passed as an argument all of a sudden or something. And that's in many cases not even necessary. So in some cases, it actually leads to less complex code by making this transformation. Yeah,
so it makes sense. So yeah, there's still a couple of other questions that are less related to this part. For instance, Lau Bannenberg asked, is there a performance impact to having really large headers? And I have to say, yeah, and I have to note that I'm less familiar on the impact of all of this, but obviously it does have an impact. However, the specific issue that I was mentioning earlier was caused by a generic varnish configuration, and there actually the limit for those headers was actually set to 8 kilobytes, and increasing it from 8 kilobytes to 16 kilobytes, which is still kind of like pretty acceptable, already solved that issue. So I think actually that's hopefully answering that question as well. On the other hand, and I think Lau also mentioned this later on in another post on YouTube, it could also be that your CSP headers are basically larger because of CSP policies of modules that you're actually not using. And how stupid is that. And then obviously the first approach is just to disable those modules, or even use composer replacements to just get rid of that module in the first place. And theoretically, that is a strategy to lead into smaller headers again. On the other hand, we discussed about Google Tag Manager and marketeers being very active in adding all of these different templates easily with a few clicks. If all of that is whitelisted as well, it could easily lead into large headers again. So personally, I would say large headers are here to stay. But what is large? It's not. It's most likely that those large headers are still smaller, a lot smaller theoretically, than the HTML document itself. But that being said, I think this is still one of those undiscovered issues that we need to bump into. But that's more the reality.
I think on that topic, I think the large headers is something that many people will definitely run into, but it's just part of the new game. Yeah. And oftentimes not even within the scope of the infrastructure they control or the hoster control, but maybe it's in the wider infrastructure like CDNs and other stuff, right? Firewalls.
Yeah. And therefore, the module that I mentioned also from Base.com, if I'm correct, is still valuable, but in preference, we try to make sure that the hosting environment is just fitting. But well, who knows? Let's move on to the final questions. Mitchell van Kleef was also asking whether the checkout would be CSP compliant as well. But I think we already covered that with the mentioning of Matewire and Livewire. Lau also came up with a question that I don't necessarily understand yet, but will the inventory comments also use glyph so that we can add things to our own scripts as well, so we can auto-collect those too? I'm a little bit blind on what he's after. So maybe, Lau, let's drink a beer. let's discuss this later on a different game. And then last but not least, there's Leon Helmus is adding CSPs from the backend of Magento a security risk. Or I think he's maybe asking it in the wrong way, but would the security of the backend benefit from adding CSP in there? Because if we want to make marketeers responsible for CSP, then they should be able to do that to themselves. Oh, like so. So I was misunderstanding the question, but what if there's some kind of backend extension, and there are some extensions already out there, that is simply allowing somebody in the backend of Magento to add things to the CSP whitelist? Well, it depends upon your policy, I guess. So if a non-technical person is made responsible for adding all of those policies, then I would say, yeah, there's a security impact there. But if it's somebody who's totally informed about on the security impact, who knows what kind of policies are added, then theoretically I would say okay-ish. I'm not sure if Vinia or Ruud.
Yeah, sorry, need to say something here.
Yeah.
SQL injection is one of the prime sources of cross-site scripting attacks. Yeah. If somebody is able to add security shards for scripts through the header, that's going to be stored in the database. And if that stuff gets read out of the database and added to the header, then that's again target for these SQL injections.
Yeah, true. We're then back to square one.
I mean, it's still one additional hoop an attacker would have to jump through. But it's almost like giving them, okay, well, you don't just have to inject the SQL with a CMS block. You also have to inject in this additional table. But if he's able to write into run, he'll also be able to write into the other. So it's like probably not a good idea if you want to honor the spirit of CSP.
Yeah, maybe that's a good end conclusion as well. That basically CSP is not making life easier, but that's not the point. It's making things more secure. And in the end, if security is harder to deal with, then theoretically that's just on purpose. And I think actually that's being agreed upon by multiple people in the chat as well. In the meantime, well, it's already 16:15, or at least in our time zone, and we were looking for ending this webinar at 4, so it's a little bit later. but I think it was definitely worth it to dive into a couple of these things, the topics that we still discussed. Maybe to close off, I just wanted to mention some things here about the YouTube channel. So this is the first time that we actually got started with things. The live stream is currently being recorded to YouTube, so later on it's available. I also created a couple of other smaller videos called so-called quick picks that you might be interested in. A lot of the topics, but actually even more, are also part of a chapter in an existing course that I've already sold online. So maybe if you know it or not, but I'm a teacher, but I'm also doing a lot of online videos. And as part of the Magento 2 Backend Development 2, what a name, course, there's a specific chapter on CSP where well, a lot of the stuff that was already covered in this webinar is just dealt with even more in depth. So I'm including also the workarounds for varnish, practically dealing with strict dynamic. The hashing bit was actually a little bit underlighted in both my story and Vinai's story. But it's showing, hopefully, also that there's so much more to explore about CSP, and that's again that reality that CSP is not that easy, but it's definitely important to focus upon. And last but not least, this was the first webinar, but we're actually looking for doing other things with the webinars in the upcoming months as well. So one thing is accessibility. With the first time that I heard about what accessibility is all about, I thought, oh, that's just easy stuff. But in reality, there's a lot to do, specifically on the theming level, once you want to do everything correctly in an efficient way. So we're going to zoom into that with Hyvä. There's also the option to use Figma design tokens, and sooner or later something about testing. Ruud, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, it's all 2025. I wanted to mention it's 2025 for the Magento CSP, but it's also 2025 for the European
Accessibility
Act. And I think it's very good that you mentioned it, that we're doing a webinar on it, and we probably will have a spectacular expert for that webinar. So all the people looking at this now should really tune in then, because we're going to make something good, and that will help you for next year to comply with all the European Union's laws.
Yeah, and that great speaker is not Vinai. So just to comment upon that. But anyway, so a lot of good stuff is still coming in upcoming webinars. But I hope you like this one on CSP. Again, I want to thank you, Vinai, for chiming in, and I think your input was definitely useful, but also highly needed, because we know that Hyvä is at least up for the job of reaching that April 2025 deadline. And let's see how the rest of Magento is surviving in the meantime. So thank you again. Thank you, Ruud. In the background was Sean, also doing all of the operations. And I hope you enjoyed it, so that we can see each other back again one day in the future. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.